Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography. Written by Chiang Meng Lin, read by Tang Da-Ming.
Part 6. War. Chapter 25. Manchuria and Korea. In the summer of 1918, some 19 years before the outbreak of actual war between Japan and China, I made a trip with a friend, Huang Yanpei, to northeast China, which the Japanese refer to as Manchuria. As this is the area where Japanese aggression in China began, it will not be inappropriate to describe how it appeared in those early years. We took a train from Shanghai to Nanjing, and thence, from across the Yangtze at Pukou, went by the Tianjin-Pukou Railway to Peking. From Pukou north, for 2 days and a night, the train traversed a vast plain. The dry dust, the arid yellow soil, and the cornfields in this enormous plain of the northern section of the country, which I was visiting for the first time, contrasted greatly with the humid black earth, winding creeks, rice fields, and hilly valleys of the south in which I was born and reared. I wondered whether the difference in geographical surroundings between north and south had much to do with the difference in physical and mental makeup of their respective peoples. The eastern coastal provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangsu, where my ancestors had lived for generations, and indeed for many centuries, were the regions in China which, down the long avenue of history, had produced great numbers of scholars, artists, and statesmen. But northern Jiangsu, together with that part of northern Anhui through which we now traveled, struck me as the poorest part of the country, where deforestation was extreme and the frequent floods of the Huai River played havoc among the population. Then we came to the Yellow River Valley, to Shandong, the northern coastal province, where people were tall, muscular, and hard-working, but much crowded through overpopulation, and finally to Peking. From the capital, of whose parks and palaces, museums and gardens, I then had my first glimpse, we continued to Mukden by the Peking-Mukden Railway, passing through Shanhaiguan Pass, the coastal terminal of the world-famous Great Wall of China, which, like a gigantic dragon, runs hundreds of miles from Gansu to the coast, separating China proper from Manchuria and Mongolia. Before the train went through the pass, we heard cicadas singing in chorus on the leaves of summer trees, just as noisily as in every other part of China. But as soon as we crossed the pass, all the trees were silent, without those singing homopterous insects. They lived and sang only inside the Great Wall. We came at night into Mukden Station, in the Japanese settlement of the city. The streets were dotted with Japanese shops and looked like a small city in Japan. Penetration of the Japanese in Manchuria was already a fact. Nothing short of victorious war could stop it. Historically, Manchuria, together with that vast territory to the west called Mongolia, had been the center of China's troubles. From time to time, the peoples of these great areas, the Huns, the Mongols, and the Tartars, made inroads inside the Great Wall and wrought havoc there. The Japanese were to be modern Tartars after entrenching themselves in Manchuria. We saw a number of officials working under General Zhang Zuolin, the local warlord in power, and learned much about Manchuria from them. We wanted to interview the general, but were advised by friends not to do so. Mukden, former capital of the ethnic Manchus before they conquered China some 300 years ago, was the capital of Fengtian province, over which Zhang Zuolin ruled. We visited the imperial Manchu mausoleums near the city, where Manchu emperors were buried before they came inside the Great Wall. From Mukden, we traveled by the South Manchurian Railway, owned and operated by the Japanese, to Kwanchengzi, which was later, after the Mukden incident of 1931, renamed Xinjing or Seizhou, and made capital of the Japanese-made puppet empire of Manchukuo. Here, the penetration was very evident. Japanese shops were everywhere to be seen. On both sides of the railroad, endless miles of luxuriant wheat nourished in the virgin soil of Manchuria bore witness that this tremendous area of North China beyond the Great Wall was the richest portion of China and could well support the tens of thousands of immigrants that flowed yearly from Shandong and Hebei provinces into this northernmost part of the Chinese Republic. To cut off Manchuria from China was to deprive her of Lebensraum and suffocate the provinces in the Yellow River Valley. Kwanchengzi was the terminal of the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway and the starting point of the Chinese Eastern Railway, formerly owned and operated by Tsarist Russia. This company had inherited a legacy of corruption from the Tsarist regime, and the line was operated by a gang of corrupt White Russian employees. People who bought tickets had to fight for a seat on the train, while free riders occupied comfortable compartments. Theft was rampant. One passenger, who slept with his shoes on in an upper berth next morning, found one of them gone. He stared at his shoeless foot and wondered how the shoe could have been stripped off without his knowing it. And I wondered, what was the earthly use of stealing one shoe without the other? All passengers kept a watch on their belongings after this strange incident. As a precaution, my companion hid his supply of rubles in the pockets of his underwear and slept with his Chinese gown on. The next morning, the rubles were gone. On our return trip at Harbin Station, as I was talking to a Chinese customs official, an American, through a window of the train, I felt someone meddling with my hip pocket. Before I could turn around, my own rubles were gone. The dilapidated city of Harbin, international metropolis of the extreme north, was a meeting place of East and West. Poor Chinese and Russian children in rags played together in the streets, and intermarriages were frequent. Children spoke a sort of hybrid language, part Chinese and part Russian. The free mixing of the poorer classes of inhabitants of Harbin was something novel to me. The bigoted foreigners of Shanghai looked down upon the poorer classes of Chinese as something that would contaminate them. Perhaps this was because few poverty-stricken Europeans ever came to stay in Shanghai. The streets of Harbin, once well paved, had gone unrepaired for years. The carriages in which we rode bounced up and down on the rough ground so badly that comfort was a negligible factor. We had constantly to grasp at something to avoid being thrown out. The sewers were choked up. After a shower, the streets turned into rivers in which the water often came up to one's knees. We met a number of people from South China who were in trade there. All the merchants did prosperous business in that frontier city by speculating in wheat, soybeans, and minerals. So long as their business was good, they had no time to worry about the dilapidated state of the Russian developed city. We went to Jilin, capital of Jilin province, one of the 3 provinces of Manchuria, and were impressed with its beautiful scenery. The city is situated on the banks of the Songhuajiang River. Climbing to the temple on the hill in the city and looking down over the widest part of the river, one saw that it was like a lake, and I was reminded of Westlake at Hangzhou. The river was rich in fish. The best fish I ever tasted was whitefish from the Songhuajiang. In old imperial days, this delicious fish found its way only to the tables of the imperial court and the princesses and grand ministers. The ginseng, the life-sustaining drug that China treasured, was also indigenous to the province. large quantities found their way every year inside the Great Wall to all the provinces. We paid a short visit to Qiqihar, capital of the province of Heilongjiang. There, we experienced an abrupt turn of summer to winter. Overnight, we noticed that the green leaves began to wither and drop from their branches. This was the northernmost city within Chinese boundaries. We could go no farther unless we went on to Siberia by the branch line which connected with the Trans-Siberian Railway. Returning to Harbin, we chartered a steamboat and sailed down the gentle Songhua-jiang to Fujinshan. For 2 days and a night, we enjoyed the mountain scenery on both sides, while mountain islands wreathed in virgin forest appeared here and there in the winding river. The evening was blessed with a brilliant moon in a clear sky, the air crisp in the northern summer night. The moon was reflected from the water, which broke into ripples of silver as our boat plowed calmly through. Often, the Songhuajiang itself appeared to have ended in a lake, with dark forested mountains rising ahead of us against the moonlit sky. But as we drew near, the river suddenly opened to left or right, and as our boat changed its course and curved gradually around the mountains, the river seemed to straighten out and roll down ahead beyond the horizon. Fujin, or Fujinshan, was a city of granaries. The wheat and soybeans produced in the surrounding hundreds of square miles all were brought to this frontier city. In the winter, it was defended against possible attacks of bandits, the Red Bears, by walls built round it with bricks of ice which melted away in summer when the defense was less necessary. Everyone carried a gun and knew how to use it. The new stock of Chinese in the frontier provinces was primitive, full of fighting spirit, and not burdened with the over-refinements of old culture. What a contrast with the over-civilized stock inside the Great Wall. Before the war, we drew our best fighters in the Chinese air forces from this strong stock from the virgin soil of Manchuria. Our final destination was Luopuxian and the plantation of a friend of ours. This district was situated at the sharp end of that spearhead of land where the Songhuajiang and Heilongjiang rivers meet and flow concurrently into the Huntongjiang, the lower part of the Heilongjiang. We went by small boat down the river, arriving at dusk, and were put up for the night in a small, lonely hut with thatched roof. A section of the broad brick bed was already occupied by an old woman and a cat, the remainder being set aside to accommodate us. 2 pigs lay comfortably on the mud floor, snoring occasionally. Mosquitoes and bedbugs annoyed us the whole night. Long before dawn, we set out for the plantation. A party of 4, we trotted on horseback in single file through miles of woods and wheat fields. Before we reached our destination, the sun had begun to come up over the horizon. Mountains were barely visible in shady outlines on the Russian side of the Heilongjiang Valley. Horseflies began to gather, and the animals bled profusely. I was riding a white horse whose coat showed streaks of blood running down. We did our best to chase away the flies with a horsetail duster. At about 6 in the morning, we came to a plantation run by a Dane. We were told that a band of Red Bears had visited the place a week before. The walls were riddled with bullets. We arrived at our destination at about 8. The plantation yielded fairly good profits for the first few years of cultivation in that virgin soil, but bandits were the real problem. A few months earlier, the little white dragon and his band had paid them a visit and carried away a large portion of the cattle and poultry. The bandits were on friendly terms with the people on the plantation, apparently, and exchanged their bad guns for good ones. After all, said the manager, the bandits are really not so bad. But if the Japanese should get control of this part of the country, it would be the end of us all. This was the final point of our northern journey. At the southern tip of the Manchurian mainland, we also visited Dalian and Lushun, both Japanese leased territories. Dalian was a commercial port through which soybeans were exported in immense quantities. Lushun was a naval base, the key to Manchuria, over which the Japanese fought the Russians in 1904. The defeat of Tsarist Russia had resulted in the transfer of the lease to Japanese hands. With railways starting from Lushun and Korea and running through South Manchuria, the Japanese had already got control of the heart and veins of the Chinese three eastern provinces. We wandered about the naval base for a day and climbed many hills trying to get a bird's eye view. Finally, on top of one of them, in the slanting sun, we came across a stone monument inscribed with the famous lines of the Tartar general who conquered the Songs in 1276. March an army of 1,000,000 men to the West Lake and mount on horseback the first peak of the Wu Mountains. At Hangzhou, overlooking the lake, the Songs had established their capital in 1127. To follow in the Tartar steps was the dream of Admiral Togo and his people after the Russo-Japanese War. And after some 30 years, the dream came true when the Japanese army entered Hangzhou after the fall of Shanghai. Korea was the springboard by which Japanese imperialism leapt to the mainland of Asia. It was over Korea that China and Japan clashed in 1894. The Sino-Japanese War for control of that ancient kingdom was the starting point of Japan's aggression on the continent. It opened a new chapter of China's history, the chapter which was to see China's reforms, revolutions, wars, sufferings, humiliation, and the eventual westernization and modernization. After our trip to Manchuria, we turned off to Korea. Crossing the Yalu River, which forms the boundary line between China and her erstwhile protectorate, we arrived by train at Incheon. From there, we proceeded to Seoul, capital of the country. The Japanese Governor-General of Korea resided in the capital. His imposing Western-style office building was located right in front of the royal palace, as if put there purposely to insult the Korean kings. The kings were gone, but the palace remained to endure the humiliation of being put back into the background. The royal palace looked exactly like the Chinese imperial palace in Peking, but on a very much smaller scale, rather like a toy palace. In the old times, when the Chinese imperial ambassador condescended to call, the king had to descend from the granite steps to meet the honored guest in the courtyard. If the ambassador had an imperial edict to deliver, His Majesty had to bend his knees in receiving the imperial favor. At the back of the palace was a Chinese pavilion in which the princesses performed the ancient Chinese dances of the Tang dynasty. In Korea, as well as Japan, ancient Chinese customs still prevailed. Their pronunciation of Chinese words, their customs, dances, music, and ways of living could all be traced back to influences of the Tang era. As I stood in the pavilion, gazing up at the mist-mantled hills of Seoul, my mind reverted to the glorious times of that dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907, when Chinese civilization shone as brilliant as the sun in a clear sky, casting its beams far beyond the horizon upon such lands as Japan, Korea, and Indochina. The offshoots of Chinese civilization grew, were preserved, and later rejuvenated in Japan, whereas in Korea and Indochina they grew and withered. The mother country of this glorious civilization had changed its manners, customs, and ways of life as the waves of invasion swept over it. Japan, which succeeded in building up a new civilization in the last century by the introduction of Western civilization upon the foundation of Chinese Tang culture, had gobbled up Korea, and, as appetite grew with eating, was on the way to swallow up China, her teacher and benefactor. But Japan taught China a lesson in her turn: how to build a strong new nation upon the foundation of old civilization. Hence China's reforms, revolutions, westernization, and modernization. While I mused thus over the past and the future, sunshine was peeping through the clouds and the mist was fast fading from the Seoul hills. The Korean who had taken me there, an old Chinese scholar, was standing by in silence, but now called my attention to a dinner engagement. We left the pavilion and passed the spot where the Princess Ming was assassinated, presumably by the Japanese for her sympathy toward China. "I know what you have been thinking," said the old scholar. "It is too late for my country now. Our kings preferred dances to the affairs of state, but China, which is your country and may be regarded as mine, has a bright future. I am old now. Brother, you are young. Do your best for China." The dinner was ready at the Chinese Consulate General, formerly the residence of China's special ambassador. What had happened behind the doors of this historic mansion during the quadrangle love affairs of China, Tsarist Russia, and Japan in courtship of the Korean lady, only those who participated knew. History gives bare outlines only. Personal records, if any, remain yet unpublished. Matters have had to be left to the imagination of posterity. Life in Seoul was being fast engulfed in Japanization. Japanese bazaars, banks, shops, and restaurants occupied prominent sections of the streets. Managers of big business, government officials, and teachers of the more important schools were all Japanese. The life of the vanquished people was fast receding into the background, like their palace. Here and there, you would see Koreans squatting complacently on the sidewalks with long stick-like pipes in their mouths, puffing to their heart's content, and women walking leisurely by with heavy loads on their heads. Some of the old type of school in which Confucian classics were taught had been left to struggle for existence. I went into such a school, which had one old scholar of the classics as teacher and a dozen pupils squatting around him on the matting. The Koreans and Japanese still kept the ancient Chinese way of squatting on their heels on the floor. It was slightly heated from beneath even in summer and was kept as clean as a bed. The pupils had to learn the Chinese classics by heart as I had done in childhood. Although they used the same textbooks, they pronounced the words quite differently. Like the Japanese and the Indo-Chinese, they had been influenced by the tongue pronunciation. All the people wore padded cotton stockings even in summer. I asked the reason and was informed that the earth was cold in the northern country. Yet they all wore white linen gowns which were quite cool. The Koreans, as well as the Japanese and Indo-Chinese, loved Chinese landscape painting, calligraphy, and poetry, but each of the three peoples retained their own individual characteristics. As it was with their arts, so it was with their lives. Korea and Indochina had come more under the Ming influence in later centuries, while Japan, beyond the sea, escaped it. Moreover, the seafaring people of Japan were highly adventurous and therefore kept the martial spirit of ancient China, while the Koreans and Indo-Chinese were touched more deeply with that complacency that tinged Chinese life in later centuries. The system of civil examinations, which conferred so much honor upon scholars in China, found its way to Korea and Indochina, but stopped at the gates of Japan. In its relation to China, the younger generation in Korea was undergoing a change under the pressure of Japanese-controlled modern schools, in which the sacred person of the Mikado was worshipped, the virtues of the Japanese exalted to the skies, and the vices of the Chinese amplified to monstrous proportions. If the attitude of young Koreans toward Japan was hatred, toward China it was contempt. While the older generation lamented the passing of the good old days of Chinese culture, the young people were made to think that they were now the blessed subjects of the Mikado's glorious empire.
What you just heard is Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-min, and published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. Some names and terminologies in this book have been updated per contemporary usages.